you want to ask a question about, wave your hand or do the raise hand, and I'll stop because I definitely want this to be a dialogue. But I'm LaCrai Mitchell, and I'm a campaign reporter at CBS News. I covered South Carolina through the primary election, so I was embedded there for the greater part of 7 or 8 months, covering all the 125 people who ran for president on the Democratic side. Just kidding. It was a lot of them. So covering their different events as they came through the state of South Carolina, talking to voters there. And then since Super Tuesday, I've been covering Florida and North Carolina. And within the past couple months here, Georgia has been added to my docket as well. And of course, these are 3 of the states that pollsters and the like are calling toss-up states, true battlegrounds. Florida, obviously, historically has been a place where, presidential candidates win by close margins, sometimes less than a percentage point. And so what you've seen now is places like Florida and North Carolina that have historically been close, you have this added factor of coronavirus. And that has sort of been the lens through every bit of reporting that we've done this cycle has had to be done with adding the coronavirus and this pandemic as context. It's completely changed the way that campaigns have campaigned, from the presidential level all the way down to, your state House and state Senate races. And what we've seen by and large is that in Florida, Vice President Biden's lead has shrank. Our latest battleground tracker shows him only up by 2 percentage points, which is a bit closer than it was when we polled back in the summer. And, Republicans will tell you it's because they've been back out organizing in person since mid-July. And Democrats will tell you that a lead is a lead in the state, so whether it's 6 percentage points or 2, they're going to say their guy is still up right now with 30 or so days out from the election. And so for me, what has been important is trying to talk to voters, obviously, is the name of the game, and talking to as many people as you can about what they're feeling about this upcoming election. And when I talk to voters in Florida, North Carolina, the issues are the same, right? It's healthcare and who is going to be the best leader for me because I have pre-existing conditions and I want to be covered. It's the economy, which candidate is best fitted to help me get back to making a living wage again. You have a slew of minority businesses and business owners as a whole that were really hit by this pandemic, that have had to permanently close in a lot of cases, particularly in Florida, where I had a chance to talk to some of those business owners. And so for them, this election is about who is going to get things back up and running where I can live again without being concerned about my business, closing in 3 months. The issues continue to be the handling of this virus. I met a woman just this weekend who was saying that for her, this is still the most important issue. She's a voter that's over the age of 65. And she says, if I get this, that could be very bad for my health. And so for her, the coronavirus is still the top issue. The issues run the gamut, but those 3, and healthcare and the economy are timeless, right? Those are always been some of the top 2 kitchen table issues, as they call them. That hasn't changed. But this pandemic has definitely, it's changed the way that campaigns campaign, and it's changed the way that voters vote. Another big issue through all of this that we've been covering and staying on top of is voter integrity and voting by mail. Things that in past elections, I think it's fair to say, certainly didn't have the same prominence that they do this cycle. In states like Florida and North Carolina, they're seeing an exponential amount of people who are applying for absentee ballots, more than they have in years past, times over. And so that has become a key part of election coverage this time around. Which states are best prepared to take on this influx of absentee ballots that they may receive? Which states are going to be counting votes days after the election because they don't start counting until election day, versus a state like Florida where they can start counting as far as 22 days out. So, you know, voter integrity has become something that's become instrumental in this. And as a campaign reporter, having to cover a lot of this from home since March, at times, and I'm sure you all can relate to this as well, it's so much harder because you can't just post up at an event and talk to 20 people who came by. Or, you know, for a long while, it was seen as taboo to even post up at the grocery store, like the library, because they're like, why are you out here? You know, coronavirus. So it's been a lot harder to talk to voters in these past months, which I will say in the weeks that we've been able to start going back and traveling again, it has made me feel so much better in my reporting because I'm actually getting to talk to real people, you know, not people that groups and organizations have sort of pushed my way, which is what we were having to do for months when we couldn't go out physically and meet people. So it has been quite an election. You know, we joke because when we started this, everyone kept telling us in beds that this is going to be the most exciting time of your life. You're going to be on buses and planes and you're never going to sleep. You're going to have to try to not eat crappy food. It's going to be great. And then in March, it just kind of was like skirt, like the brakes on a really fast going train. And it's nothing that we expected, but I think we have tried. I know I have tried to make the best of this. And, you know, there's still these stories to be told. So we've been trying our best to get those stories out there. And like I said, please ask questions as you have them. I love to talk a little bit about my reporting that we've done during this time too, but actually I'll do that and then we can open it up for questions. Maybe that'll spark some other questions too. So during this time, we started a series on cbsnews.com called COVID Chronicles, where we decided to take a look at how the pandemic was impacting various industries in the battleground states. So businesses, hunting, mining, the food industry, dry cleaners. How has this pandemic impacted all of these different people's lives? And my stories came out of, you know, I talked to business owners in Florida and North Carolina. I spoke with utilities in Michigan, where, you know, so Detroit, Michigan has a longstanding issue with water shutoffs. And a lot of times they disenfranchise communities and neighborhoods that are already disenfranchised as it goes. And so what was interesting during coronavirus is that the state of Michigan, the city of Detroit worked together to turn back on water for these families. But for a minute, before they decided to extend this moratorium on shutoffs through the year, there was a question of, were they going to start those shutoffs back off, and were there going to be people without water, the most vulnerable in our community, without water during a pandemic where you need to be able to wash your hands to keep germs off, you know, a pandemic where, you need water even when there's not a pandemic, but certainly when there is one. So I had a chance to talk to water advocates in the city that knew the issue well, and the city of Detroit, about what goes into, you know, this highly controversial subject. And it was enlightening because in an election year where for a while Governor Gretchen Whitmer was being rumored as a potential VP pick, something like this got a lot more eyes, I think, than it normally would have, you know? And so it was great to be able to highlight that sort of a thing. And in some cases, a lot of people didn't even realize that Detroit had this long-standing issue with water shutoffs. So that's been something that I've been proud to cover during this time. And in terms of the, on the utility side for Florida, I took a look at what school districts were doing to prepare ahead of restarting school And in some cases, kids who didn't have access to technology, didn't have access to internet, didn't have laptops, which meant that if you couldn't afford to have a laptop or the internet, you would be forced then to go in person to school. And did that leave certain students more vulnerable and at risk than others if they couldn't afford those things? Well, a deep dive showed that in some counties, they obviously knew that this was going to be a serious problem, and they started to prepare by buying additional technology so that students in the county could have computers and could make a true decision and choice on whether or not to come back that was not based off of how much their parents made. So that story was enlightening, and being able to keep up with how that has transitioned has been interesting too, because on the political side of this, you have Florida, which has a Republican governor, Governor Ron DeSantis, who is an outspoken supporter of the president, who arguably, won his election because of the president coming out and endorsing him in a very public way. So you have a Republican governor who some say is very motivated to get the economy back rolling, to get schools back reopened, because that's something that we're hearing from the national level that needs to be done. And it's just been beyond interesting to see how that's played out on the county level and the city level and local level from these Democratic mayors who are like, I'm having a mandate in my county. Like, I don't care what I don't care what they're saying at the top. In Orange County, in Orlando, Florida, you're gonna wear a mask. So that's been very interesting too, to keep up with sort of that push and pull from the state and local level too throughout this election.
You're in two really important states, North Carolina and Florida, that are swing states, and I think they both went to Trump last time. And it's open this time. Is the mood different in either of the two different states, or is the mood similar? And what about the debate last night? Do you sense that's had any impact on the mood today? Is the mood changing, or what do people think about what happened last night?
I'll start with the debate part of your question first. What I'm hearing from just initial talking to the organizers that I talked to in different states, I'm not sure that it pushed the needle either way. From our internal count, there were more than 70 interruptions, like direct interruptions between President Trump and Vice President Biden last night. And I know that, out of context, it's like, well, what does that mean? That means that there was a lot of crosstalk, and at points you couldn't hear what either one of them were saying. I know because I had the pleasure of exacting it, and I'm trying to say what they said exactly, and at times I have no idea what either one of them are saying as I'm rewinding it back. And, for me, I always think of this as I'm someone who is keeping up with their platform points and the changes in their messaging daily in a way that I know your average voter isn't. I know my parents aren't. I mean, I think they're watching a lot more because I'm home now and I'm like, hey, we've got to watch this tonight. But on average, your average person who's going to work, they come home, they don't want to hear sort of this, back and forth that can just sound like, you don't know what they're saying. I don't know that it moved the needle for anyone. And I think for the people who were already decided, you are looking at the debate through a lens of, that's my guy, whichever side that is. And so if your guy is President Trump, you thought that him interjecting looked strong and impassioned. If your guy is Vice President Biden, you think that it wasn't very presidential of the president to interject so many times. So I don't know that it moved the needle for that small percentage of voters that are still undecided, because it is a small number. And to be quite honest, I'm not confident that the other two debates to follow will be differently, the presidential ones. I actually tend to think that the vice presidential debates, because the personalities of Vice President Pence and Senator Kamala Harris are different, that I think that we might hear more during the vice presidential debate. But that's yet to be seen, and we don't have much longer to wait, because we will see how that plays out. Now, to your question about, do I feel like the mood is changing from last time around? It's hard to gauge, Eric, because Vice President Biden is such a different type of candidate than Hillary Clinton was. And I think what we have seen in the years since that election, in story after story, analysis after analysis, is so much of, that election was about people who didn't like Hillary Clinton, and so they just didn't vote. And I think that voter turnout this time around is it could be much higher, which will change the stakes. And so, what do you take from that? Answering your question, is the motivation there? Is there a different type of, is there a motivation there that might have been lacking last time that's going to actually get people out to vote in a way that they didn't last time? It's yet to be seen. I will say, though, I have met very few voters that voted for the president last time and who do not plan to vote for him this time, even if they don't like his rhetoric, even if they don't like everything he says. I've met very few people who voted for him last time who are not certain that they're going to vote for him again this time. I will say that.
Wow. Okay. It's interesting. Felix Wessel from Deutschlandfunk in Cologne has a question. Go ahead, Felix.
Hi, Felix.
Hi. So President Trump is talking a lot about socialism, Antifa, the radical left, and such things. And I read that this strategy could be especially successful with Asian or Chinese immigrants and Cuban immigrants in Florida, especially Cuban immigrants in Florida, because they have this aversion because of their roots against socialism and left-wing politics.
Sure.
And Biden, I read that Biden is also underperforming among Latino voters, especially in Florida. So could these issues help tip the state to Trump? What's your position on that? What are you thinking?
Sure. So I'm going to, if I can, lean a little bit on our latest Battleground Tracker poll that our polling unit did out of Florida and Texas. And it actually, that poll has Vice President Biden up by 20 points among likely Hispanic voters in Florida. And in terms of the question of, socialism, our poll said that relatively more Hispanics see Biden's policies as the right mix of socialism and capitalism. That was 46% that felt like that. Whereas just 39% felt that he had moved too far towards socialism. So what does all of that mean? The first thing to remember about Florida is that we have this Hispanic population that has continued to boom over the past decade. And it's not just Cuban Americans, it's Puerto Ricans, it's Colombians, Venezuelans, and depending on where you are in state, that changes drastically. In Orlando, which is more central Florida, there's a huge Puerto Rican community. There was an influx of Puerto Ricans that moved in after Hurricane Maria. And let me tell you, because I just spoke with them for the piece that we did last week, they have not forgotten that the president went to Puerto Rico and was tossing out paper towels, okay? They have not forgotten that there were communities that were living in motels for weeks when they got to Florida because the resources weren't there. But if you look in South Florida, in Miami, there's a huge Cuban population that's been there for a while now. And I mean, we spoke with a barber in Miami a couple weeks ago who was like, my family's absolutely voting for Trump because we can't have this Democrat who's going to bring back socialism. We can't go back to that time. And so, I pointed to the polls because I like to have like that, numeric backing. But the truth is, in my conversations, it can go either way, right? And these polls are taken at a moment in time, but at any given time, and we still have 30 days, that sort of sentiment can change. I think, you know, in terms of Biden's performance with Hispanic voters in Florida, I will say, I think his team recognizes that he has work to be done in that area. And so what you've seen is you have the coalition of Cubanos con Biden in Miami, where they have a group of grassroots organizers who are putting on like car caravans. You know, he came to Orlando, to Kissimmee, for the kickoff of Hispanic Heritage Month a couple weeks ago. You know, he did an event there where there's a huge Puerto Rican community. So his campaign is making very pointed and taking very pointed actions. They also, during that trip where he came to Kissimmee, released their plan for Puerto Rico, the Biden-Harris plan for Puerto Rico. And it happened to coincide, if I'm remembering correctly, just days before the anniversary of Hurricane Maria first hitting Puerto Rico. So, you know, I would argue that the campaign understands that they have work to be done in that area, and they're starting to do that. What you've seen on the other side is with President Trump's campaign, you know, he's done a roundtable with Venezuelan members of the Venezuelan community in South Florida. His press releases that come out through the state sometimes reference, you know, socialism and sort of those hot topic issues. So both teams understand the importance of Hispanic voters in the state. And I don't have this number off the top of my notes right now, but I could definitely, I know I could get my hands on it easily enough to send it to Eric, and maybe he could send it out. But Pew did a study after the 2016 election that showed which part of the Hispanic diaspora in Florida went to Trump and Hillary. And it did show that Cuban voters voted for him in higher numbers than non-Cuban voters. And it was an interesting breakdown of that sort. But I would say, Felix, you know, the most important thing to remember in terms of outreach to Latino voters in Florida is that Latino voters is one umbrella for a lot of different communities under there. Yeah. And that nuance is like everything. It's very important to remember. And I see some other questions over here, Eric. So I'm gonna, I see, yep.
Go ahead,
Great.
Gina, ask your question.
Well, actually, I have more questions than answers, as usually the case. But one of the first ones is that what kind of an impact do you think the New York Times article about Trump's tax returns will have on both his supporters and on the undecideds? Do you think it will have any impact?
We were out in the field as that news was breaking over the weekend, and for whatever it's worth, it didn't come up automatically from voters without us asking. I tend to think that, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to say this, but I think of communities like Henderson, North Carolina, or Willow Spring. You know, Willow Spring, North Carolina has been described to me as a place with 2 stoplights, right? And we know those communities in every state in the country, the very small rural ones. I tend to think that that kind of news trickles down later and doesn't tend to have the same impact. You know, so for some voters that are keeping up with it, yes, I think it will have an impact. But again, and I hope I don't sound like a broken record saying this, but I do think this is really the case, it's still going to be very partisan. The people who don't like him are going to use this as another example of why he's unfit. His supporters are going to say, he was a smart businessman who was able to figure out loopholes. You know, that's why he should be the person in charge of our economy. You know, however lacking in facts and context that is, I think that's where we are. It's so partisan, and that I can attest to. Now that I have seen with my own eyes this entire cycle. Each camp voters are, if that makes sense.
Do you think it'll affect the undecideds, though? Do you think it might win some people over? Or will they just accept that it's fake news?
I don't know. You know, I don't know. I tend to think that I think about, and I'm going to keep using stories because I feel most comfortable rooted in conversations I've had instead of trying to be a pollster, which I'm not. I think about this group of guys that I met during the primary, and they had traveled from North Carolina to South Carolina to see Andrew Yang in a city about an hour or so outside of Columbia, South Carolina. And I'm talking to them, and they identified as independent voters. They had actually voted for, Bernie Sanders, I believe, the last time around. And I remember one of those voters saying something along the lines of like, I'm doing my homework, I'm gonna do the research, I'm reading these articles, but at the end of the day, when I get into the ballot box, I still don't know how that's gonna go. They were basically saying, with all of this research that I'm doing, all of this legwork in the beginning, I still think that on election day, and this was for the presidential preference primary, I don't know how that's going to shake out when I get into that booth, when it's just me and myself and my vote. And I said that to say that for undecided voters and independent voters what I find is they really pride themselves on having just like this right to choose whatever feels right. And that's why they don't identify with either party, right? They like the freedom that comes with being able to decide as they see fit. And I don't know, but if they're like the guy that I met, I think some of them, they don't know until they're going to get in there how that affects their vote.
Okay, great. Maybe we'll go to Max White's question and come back to some more of Gina's later. Gina.
Okay.
Max
Thanks,
White.
Eric.
Go ahead, Max.
Hey, LaCrai, thanks for joining us. I'm actually in Detroit, so thanks for doing the story on the water shutoffs. It's good to get some national.
It's such an important one. Yes.
Yeah.
And Godspeed to you and the other reporters who are having to cover an issue like that for so many years. I mean, it being so systemic. So
yeah, it's kind of crazy. So just to get it out in the national spotlight was great.
Right.
But it's perfect timing because I have to hop off here for another meeting, but I'll ask the question and finish watching this later. But there's so much talk about, like the suburbs and the importance of their role in the elections. And in 2018 in Michigan, we had a lot of suburbs flip we had 2 congressional seats flip from Republican to Democrat in the suburbs. So what is that kind of looking like in the areas that you're covering?
Sure. So I can tell you in North Carolina and Georgia, we're seeing that same, the political scientists that I speak with regularly are seeing the same flip that you're describing. In the suburbs outside of Fulton County in Georgia, which is home to Atlanta, Georgia, the largest county in the state, they are seeing that sort of the Democratic leanings of Atlanta are starting to spread out into Gwinnett and some of the surrounding counties. In North Carolina, I've spoken with political scientists who say the same thing, that in the suburbs around Raleigh, in the suburbs around Charlotte and Mecklenburg County, you're seeing that same sort of spread. And they're thinking that in some of those counties, those suburban voters have flipped. Like, they're not registered as Democrats, but they're going to vote for Biden. They've been turned off by the president. They're not convinced that he's kept his promises, and they're ready to make the switch. In Florida, it's a little bit different because take a city like Jacksonville, Florida, which is in Duval County. Duval County is historically very Republican, down to even the local level, right? The mayor of Jacksonville is Republican, the former chair of the state Republican Party. A city like that, has voted conservative Republican candidates. But in 2018, Duval County elected Andrew Gillum, who was running for governor against Ron DeSantis, and they voted for Senator Bill Nelson, who ended up losing to Rick Scott. And so Democrats point to that flip in 2018 as evidence that somewhere like Jacksonville has become more diverse. It's become younger. You've had people of color move in, and that has pushed Republicans and white Republicans out into the suburbs. And so they've become more Republican and more conservative than the city center. So it's interesting to see that in different states, in the big cities, you've seen different things happen within the suburbs. You know, the other thing that I think is important to mention about Florida suburbs, though, is that when you talk about Florida suburbs, it's not what you think of traditionally. I think when you think of, say, the suburbs in Pennsylvania, you know, Florida, the suburbs in Gainesville, you have middle class, wealthy African-American families. And then the suburbs or the exurbs in Pensacola, which might look, you know, more white, more working class. So it's not like suburb is one kind of image in a state like Florida in a way that I think it is in other places.
Okay, great, thanks. Michelle Morganti in California, I think. Michelle, want to ask your question?
Oh, hi, thank you. But I was more just offering something to the group. The Univision had a really interesting poll on Latinos. So if anyone's interested in the topic, I'm just sharing the link.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, I see that. It shows 50% of Cubans, surprisingly. Yeah, and our poll too, I'm glad you mentioned this, Michelle. Our poll too showed that there is a shift, even within Cuban voters in Florida. There's like a generational divide. So older Cuban voters might be more likely to vote for the president. They support him, and younger, you know, Cuban voters are coming around and they're like, I don't quite see social, you know, like there's not that same visceral, you know, aversion to socialism. And I don't think that means that it's not important, but that it's like with any demographic, right? The younger, I mean, we saw that in the primary with African-American voters in South Carolina, older voters who were like, Biden is my guy, and younger voters who were like, this is more of the same. Like, we need someone more progressive. So I'm glad you mentioned, thank you for putting that up, Michelle, because that is something that we've seen too, like the age divide, even within that voting bloc.
It's interesting that the Puerto Rican, the Cuban voters in Florida are traditionally so pro-Republican, right? I mean, for decades, the Republicans could always count on strong support from the Cubans. Why is that? From the revolution in 1959 or something? Or why are the Cubans in Florida so pro-Republican when other Hispanics in other parts of the country are often pro-Democrat? What's going on in Florida? Why is it so different?
I do think that there's the historical element that you just described. But also, I mean, even thinking about this cycle, I'm thinking about, you know, phone calls that Senator Rubio has had with the campaign for the state, or some of the events that I was describing earlier, where there has been this pointed push, this pointed appeal to Cuban voters in the state. I think there's the historical element of it, but there's also the Republican Party has done their due diligence in really appealing to that block of voters in a way that I'm not sure that the Democratic Party had done in years past. I was in Charleston being on the street interviews one day and met a Cuban American voter who lived in Florida and was visiting Charleston with one of her friends. And she talked to me for 30 minutes about how she felt like the president was the best thing. She loved that he was getting strict on immigration because she had gone through the process of becoming a citizen, and everyone should have to. I mean, for half an hour we talked, and the I was hinting at this a few minutes ago. There is like a visceral sort of like, I mean, she was impassioned, and it reminded me of just like this community of people in parts of the state that for them it's the history of it, but they also feel like that's the party that has appealed to them and has made the pointed effort of bringing them into the fold. And so I think there's a little bit of that too, Eric, if I'm being honest, sort of which party has done a better job of making, this block of voters feel like they're important and that they sympathize with the issues that are important to them.
Yeah, it's totally fascinating with Florida and North Carolina. I believe Obama won those two states, right? Florida has 29 electoral votes and North Carolina is 15 or something.
Yes, and Obama won Florida in 2008 by like 200,000 plus votes, and in 2012 by just like 73,000 or so votes. So again, to speak to those margins that you talked about. But in North Carolina, he won in 2008 and then lost in 2012.
Ah, okay. And Trump won both states in 2016, right?
Yes.
So a lot of people talk about Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, but Florida and North Carolina were two important states that Trump won as well.
And also remember in North Carolina, Trump won, but a Democratic governor won. Cooper won. And so North Carolina also has that dynamic where you can meet a Trump supporter who agrees with everything that Cooper has been doing to handle the coronavirus, and they plan to split the ticket. Wow. In a way that is not that you don't hear that in Florida so much. I'm voting for Biden, but DeSantis is great. I have not heard that yet on the trail. So that's something interesting to remember too.
Okay, great. We have another question here from Brian Weekland from MSNBC in New Jersey. Go ahead, Brian.
Hi guys. Hi. Yeah, I'm just curious. Obviously, racial politics, racial justice has played a huge role in our culture here in the United States over the last couple years. We saw last night at the debate, President Trump would not disavow racists or white supremacists. He said to the Proud Boys group, stand back and stand by. This is obviously, you have the Black Lives Matter movement. This has been a huge part of the election. I'm curious, just from a personal perspective, as you've talked to voters, as you've covered the campaigns, have you experienced any hostility or overt racism from Trump supporters that you've talked to or that you've interviewed?
Great question, Brian. Thank you for that question. It's an important question because to the point that you just made, the racial reckoning that we've seen in this country has absolutely become a thread in this election. And it's something that voters have told me they will be thinking about as they go to the polls. Who do they think sympathizes most and would help unify the country along racial divides? So thank you for this question. In terms of personal experiences, I can honestly say that and you were asking about Trump supporters specifically, in all of my encounters with Trump supporters, I've never felt, that someone was being hostile with me. I've never had, any of some of the experiences that we have seen and heard of being described, thankfully. And I'm really happy about that. And I'd even go a step further to say, something that is interesting, though, when I have spoken with Trump supporters as it relates to race is a lot of times if I'm asking a question about race and Black Lives Matter comes up, there is sort of I don't want to call it like a hesitation, but I think Trump supporters are very aware of what people think of sometimes when they are stereotyped. So what I found is in conversation, it feels a little bit like they're like, and I don't agree with the Black Lives Matter movement, but and so and so I to that point I've actually found that kind of interesting because a lot of times I think people think of sort of this like, I don't like Black Lives Matter, and I haven't experienced that. You know, if anything, as a matter of fact, one of the guys we talked to this weekend, he kind of like made it a brush over and like looked at me as he said it. And then like, you know, he's like, and I don't really agree with Black Lives Matter, but you know, the economy is so great. So I haven't had any experiences, thankfully, that were hostile. But look, you know, I've covered a Trump rally where, and I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say this, you know, it's me and maybe 10 other African-American people in a, you know, in an arena filled with people. You know, we were covering one in Charleston, in North Charleston, and there was a Caucasian woman holding up a Blacks for Trump sign. And I remember it because I was like, I guess there are only like, you know, only so many other like Black people in this arena right now that like could be holding up the sign. But I remember it because it was one of those things where I felt like you know, in that moment, in terms of reporting and editorial, you know, the sign was there as an indicator that the campaign has thought about this block of voters. But in this room, like I said, I felt like, you know, figuratively speaking, I could count on my hands how many people were in the room and how many African American people were in the room, myself included. And so there is just like on face value, right? Sort of the optics of that, that the campaign has to reckon with. And the way they've done that, it feels like is, you know, they have surrogates who, I mean, even in Florida, I'll take Florida, you know, even in Florida, there are groups that like identify as Black voters for Trump. You started hearing the radio ads, you know, Black voters for Trump group. And even if it's not endorsed by the candidate, you know, even if it's not endorsed by the president, there are the radio ads of, I'm a Black voter and I feel like the president has done X, X, and X for me. I'm in North Carolina. I saw a commercial this morning where they had an African-American couple who, you know, they showed video of them like shaking the president's hand and them talking about how he's the best candidate for them and they're going to vote for him. So, you know, the campaign is on it in a way. I shouldn't say on it. What I'm trying to say is the campaign obviously understands the appeal that needs to be made to that voting bloc as well. And that has manifested in, you know, targeted appeals to them, to Black voters.
Okay, Martin Buckel from ZDF in Munich. Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, hi. I watched yesterday night the debate, and for me, I mean, two guys, and they always said it's wrong, not true, wrong, and it was hard for me to know what is wrong and what's right. So, CNN, all media is talking about fact checking, and my question is: does this sort of fact checking is useful for the voters? Do they check it, or do you think that there would be a better way to organize those debates? Because it was so hard for me to follow what is true, what's wrong, and you said it was crazy for me to watch.
It can be overwhelming, right? You know, like if every sentence you feel like someone's like, flag on the play, fact, flag on the play, false. I'm glad you brought up the question because I do think it speaks to sort of the greater image of the role of media in this election, right? And as I've talked to voters, you'd be surprised how many times I'm interviewing a person and they say something about the quote unquote fake media, you know, which that would be me included, right? and there's no qualms about it, you know. The media is fake. You've got this microphone in my face and you're gonna go cut up this interview how you want. There is a very real distrust. And I think for voters who already are distrustful of the media, those fact checks, I don't know that they're helpful because I'm not certain that they believe the information. You know what I mean? So interjecting every 10 seconds becomes a distraction, especially if they don't feel that the information is useful or accurate or true. On the flip side, I've met tons of people who, I mean, just last week in the airport, I had a woman who saw that I had on CBS on my jacket, and she's grabbing her bag and she says, "Thank you for your service. Thank you for the work you're doing." And I felt bad. I was like, oh my gosh, like, oh, we're just reporting the facts, but thank you. But I said that to say there are voters too who they are depending on our fact checks. They don't have time to go back and look up labor or labor statistics on what's happened with the unemployment rate during this pandemic. They don't have time to fact check how many jobs have been added or taken away and to provide the appropriate context for that. And so there is, this, I would go as far to even say this, this yearning for correct information from some voters who want to feel informed, but the problem therein lies, right? Which station or news channel or cable news are they depending on for that, right? And does said cable news have any other, do they have leanings, political leanings? Do they have other interests that they're having to keep in mind? I think therein lies like the root of, the distrust part of it, but also where you run into trouble with fact checks, right? Who's fact checking? And do they have any interest on leaving any parts of the context out? Because I will tell you this, as someone who has had to do her fair share of fact checking, a lot of the times it's not a simple true or not true. In my own experience, a lot of the times it's more along mostly true or mostly false, which means that there's some gray in there, and that you can take a statistic and you can say it this way with these sentences around it, and it's one thing, and you can say it this way with these set of words around it, and it can mean something totally different. And both are the figures are true and accurate, but the context isn't there. So it's hard for me to answer whether or not I personally think they're needed, because I feel like my role isn't to make that call. But for voters, I think it depends on where they fall on how much they trust the media, or they're looking for the media to inform them and do that due diligence. Great question, though.
One example of fact checking being really useful I saw last night when President Trump said that the Obama administration left 170 justices unfilled. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. But then I read the fact check later, and it was because the Republican Senate was blocking them. It wasn't just so that was an important little fact that was added to the story later. So.
Correct. The context, right? That like second sentence is everything, right? Because without that second sentence, you're like, they did what? And what's dangerous about that is how easy it is for that then to become a talking point for voters. I mean, I have met voters on the trail that can word for word almost give you the stump speech of their preferred candidate. And if that stump speech is riddled with non-contextual statistics, that's then spread to their communities of friends and the people that they're talking to about voting. So there is this danger that lies in not having that extra context, because that's the difference between a Trump supporter taking that figure from the debate and using that as they're explaining to people why they should vote for him. And it's the difference between a Biden supporter taking that and being like, but that second sentence is that we were being blocked from that. And so it wasn't just this sort of apathetic, we don't care about it. Yeah.
So Gina has some more questions. Go ahead, Gina.
She has lots and lots of questions. LaCrai, first of all, I want to say you're doing just a great job, and I'm really impressed with your work. And I'm not at all surprised that the people aren't being hostile to you, because I feel like we get back what we give out, and you're such a positive person that they must be very apologetic about their not less than wonderful thoughts. But my question is, I guess the one that most weighs on my mind is, having lived through the election in 2000 in Florida when it was such a debacle, what measures have they put in place to make sure that that doesn't happen again? And just a few days ago, the president made a comment that if the Republican governors determined, and my understanding from what he said was he felt that they could determine just themselves that the elections in their state were fraudulent, that they could then throw all of the electoral votes to him. And that sounded, particularly given our history here in Florida, really, really scary. Do you have any thoughts on any of that? And also he encouraged last night his supporters to go to the polls to watch closely, which I'm concerned that that's voter intimidation, voter suppression. You know, what do we do to maintain the integrity in this state where elections are sometimes an illusion?
So I will tell you that political divisions across the board have people who are focused on the voting integrity of this election, and they have to, because it is going to be so instrumental because of the reasons I outlined earlier about just like the influx of absentee ballots and the like. So something that I've found particularly interesting in Florida and in Georgia too, for sure, is that the state board of elections, you know, the highest election official, your supervisor of elections of a state, I found it so interesting that in some cases the board is so, they remind me that it's county boards of elections that run elections. They say, we're the state, but I'm thinking about, Georgia. Georgia's Board of Elections, they have been helping recruit poll workers. And so, on one hand, they say to me, look, we're helping. Like, this is our role is to help. Elections are run by the county boards of elections. And so to that vein, what you've seen, I think, is that different counties within Florida have done their due diligence to, on the health front, make sure that people feel safe to come out and vote, knowing that they will have hand sanitizer provided to them, that they will have clean pens. On the actual, and on the integrity and making sure that these votes are counted appropriately, I've found that some boards are more transparent than others about the information that's readily available when you go to county boards of elections websites. But look, I was much younger in 2000 when everything happened with the hanging chads. But I will tell you that, 16 years later here as a reporter that's covering this, that's still something that comes up, and having been someone born in Florida, and have you being someone who's lived there, you know that it's sort of in some circles a joke, right? Like Florida's still counting votes type of thing. And there are counties that have, historically been riddled with those kind of issues, and some of the counties in South Florida, it seems like there is always something that like isn't right. So I think some county boards have tried to be more transparent in this process. In Florida, what you saw early on is a group of organizations sued the state, saying that the state had not prepared to have an election during a pandemic, and they weren't putting the proper protocols in place to keep voters safe. And from that, the state division of elections said that they would be working with county boards, outlining and giving guidance on how to run this election safely and carefully. I don't know that that same attention has been put on the actual tallying of and tabulating of these votes. But what I think, and what I think is important to remember, like I said earlier, they can start counting votes as far as 22 days out. And I believe that there is this hope that with that much of a head start, some of the mitigation that comes with like the pressure of just trying to get everything done on election night might be alleviated. It's yet to be seen, but I would like to think that 22 days out gives you more time to recognize voters that aren't, ballots that aren't correct. It gives you more time to cure those ballots, gives you more time to realize processes that may not be working. gives you more time to train poll workers and election administrators on the county level how to use machines, which was a big thing during the June 9th primary in Georgia. People literally just didn't know how to use the machines. So in some cases, you know, they hadn't had the training. And that's yet to be seen too, because of coronavirus, people haven't necessarily been out doing in-person training still. So we don't know how that's going to play out there either. But I think that county election officials are more than aware of sort of the weight that is going to come with this election. The last point I'll make on this is, again, it's so important for us as journalists to make sure that we are, like in some of these cases, for example, where the president came to North Carolina and told voters essentially to vote twice. Voting twice is a felony here. And so we do have a responsibility to let voters know, wait. I know he said this yesterday, but the State Board of Elections, Karen Brinson-Bell, says that if you vote twice here, that's a felony. Like, you know, the Attorney General here in North Carolina has been very on, he's a Democratic AG, but on Twitter, he has whole threads of, you don't want to do that. Let me tell you why. You don't want to come to the polling site on election day asking questions that, you know, like there are mechanisms in place so that you don't have to do that. So it's just important for us to make sure we're getting the correct facts out around that, because in some cases it's a legal thing, you know?
Okay, we'll have about 5 or 10 more minutes and 2 or 3 more questions here. Bartosz Dudek from Deutsche Welle in Bonn Radio. Bartosz, go ahead, ask your question.
Yes, I have. First, LaCrai, thank you for your great talk. You're a great person.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I have a question because on November the 3rd, also the US Senate will be, or the election for the US Senate will be held. How are the chances that the Democrats would gain or regain the majority there?
So this is a very, you are right. You have a lot of different sort of happenings going on in these Senate races. So take North Carolina, for example, where Republican Senator Tom Tillis is going up against Democratic challenger Cal Cunningham. You know, our latest poll on North Carolina shows that Senator Tillis is still up. But it is one of those races here that people talk about and they know about. I mean, as we've been talking to voters and we ask them about the presidential race and then we ask them about the Senate race, people know who the candidates are and they're watching. You know, the amount of commercials that I've seen in the past week here in North Carolina about either senatorial candidate, it's interesting because it is definitely one of these crucial Senate races for Republicans. You know, and Republicans will tell you that that North Carolina is a state that they're watching as it comes to the senatorial race. In Georgia, where you have, you know, Kelly Loeffler running, it's the special election for the Senate. She's running against Doug Collins, and she's running against a Democratic challenger, Reverend Raphael Warnock. And they're all right there together. I mean, some of the latest polls have Kelly at like 23% and Warnock and Doug Collins at 20%. It's tight. And everyone's saying that one is definitely going to go into a runoff after Election Day because it is so tight.
Mm-hmm. I think there are.
And then I would point you to South Carolina. Oh, go ahead. What were you saying, Eric?
Go ahead. Talk about South Carolina first, and then I'll mention.
Were you about to say how many people are running for Senate in that Georgia special election?
No. A total of 34 Senate seats are up this time, about a third every time. And I think Republicans hold 23 of those. So Republicans have more, in theory, to lose in this 2 years ago, it was the other way around. Democrats had more seats to lose. So, yeah, Republicans are defending 23 of the 34 seats, I think, in this cycle.
And I think in some places it's become the pressure around it has become more than in other places. And that's why I was about to go to South Carolina, because South Carolina, where you have incumbent Senator Lindsey Graham, you know, arguably for years, he hasn't had the same sort of competition that he does this time around, where the Democratic candidate has raised a ton of money. And in some cycles, I believe Harrison has outraised him. And so what you're seeing now is Senator Graham's campaign in the state, you know, well, Democrats there would tell you that he's having to start getting into dirty politics, where he's like coming after like staffers and things that tweets that they made a decade ago type of thing. But I try not to get as sucked into that as just, I mean, what you see from the aerial view is that here is this longtime Republican senator who actually has to campaign this time around, because there is a Democratic candidate who has the money to be able to last in this race in a way that we haven't seen maybe in other cycles. So what does that mean overall? I think it means that, like I said, there are definitely these key states where you have Republicans putting money and time because they know that these Senate races are important. And in Georgia, like I said, it's almost certain to be a runoff for Kelly Loeffler's seat in the special Senate race. But the other thing to remember, and I think it's important you just raised this, Eric, is that this is one of those things that can change from election to election. You know, the last time around, the Democratic Party had something to lose. And this time around, the Republicans have something like seats to lose or to be lost. And so, you know, that sort of shift in the dynamic, it comes up, and as it comes up, both sides try to put up a good fight. You know, the thing about these battleground states and what continues to make them battleground states, places like, you know, North Carolina and now Georgia, is because it's not just about the presidential election, right? And so one of the things that's come up even today on the heels of the debate last night is, how does the president's performance play out for someone like Senator Thom Tillis here in North Carolina? Did that performance help him? Did it hurt him? And then the last thing I'll say is just, it's interesting to look at how closely or not closely these Senate candidates align themselves with the top of their ticket. And so if you look sometimes, for example, in Georgia, you have both Doug Collins and Kelly Loeffler saying, no, the president, he loves me. No, the president, he supports me. Because in Georgia, you know, it is arguable that that's needed in a way that Tillis doesn't necessarily have to do that in North Carolina. And so I've had political scientists point out to me that he's actually done this thing where he doesn't necessarily he doesn't necessarily so closely align himself in the same way that you see in other states.
Okay, thanks. Dolores Hinckley, and also in Florida. Go ahead, Dolores.
Yes, in Florida with the Florida question. So it's so interesting to listen to your on-the-ground experience with voters. And I'm curious what you've heard about Amendment 4, which, you know, for anybody following Florida politics is a huge deal. But I'm interested to see, you know, 60 Minutes did a huge piece on it. Is it, though, something like the New York Times report where it doesn't really come up? Or is it something voters care about? And I say, you know, those who can vote, because it has the potential to either re-enfranchise many or disenfranchise, you know, the same amount, depending on all these court decisions.
Yes, I definitely think I definitely think that is an issue that is resonating with voters. Even the folks who are, you know, there are folks who are formerly incarcerated who are now sort of at the head of this movement, making sure that people like them who have been formerly incarcerated do have this right. And I think it's because of the sheer number of people that it affects, you know, tens of thousands of people who can either vote or not vote, depending on how this plays out. I will say, I don't know that every voter has been able to keep up with the TikTok of it, because there has been so much movement, even this summer, you know, in, you know, the earlier part of the summer, you had a judge who said it's unconstitutional for people to not be able to vote because they can't afford to pay their fines, fines that are sometimes hard to figure out how much you owe. And then the Supreme Court, you know, held that ruling, right? So then it's like, wait, roadblock. And then in September, a court in Atlanta decides that it is constitutional. So there's like all these different like TikToks back and forth, and I don't know that voters have been able to keep up with that. I think this is what I would say. In 2018, Florida voters made it abundantly clear where they fell on that issue. You know, they voted for Amendment 4, and I think it's safe to say the thought was that they were allowing for people who have done their time and have gotten out to be able to vote. And the fact that it has been caught up in so much litigation, I just think just look at what the results were. If Floridians didn't want this, it would not have, you know, that amendment would not have passed. Like the people, the voters, I think made their voice very clear on that issue. And so it is something that is important, in that I know that CBS, I'm really thankful and happy that we've done our due diligence. There's always more that can be told, but, you know, I am so happy to see that so many different broadcasts have talked about such an important issue.
Okay, great. Maybe one last quick question from Michelle Morganti. And I put your email onto the chat room. I hope that's okay if anybody has any more detailed questions for you.
Yes, absolutely. No, that's great. I'm glad. I see where you did that. Thank you for that.
Good. So Michelle has a nice sort of final question about the enthusiasm. Go ahead, Michelle.
Sure, thanks. And before I end, just thank you, LaCrai, for doing this. It's been really interesting and informative. So my question is, so someone who's out there on the ground, I think you might have a better perspective on this, but a lot has been said about the winner of this race is going to be the winner of the enthusiasm gap. You know, which side can rally the enthusiasm among their supporters to actually get them to cast their ballots. I think 4 years ago, Trump clearly had the enthusiasm on his side.
Yes.
What are you seeing this year?
That is a great question, Michelle. And it is not an easy question. And it probably would have been easier for me to answer during the primary, when I could gauge that enthusiasm off of how many people were coming to events, how many people were standing in lines in the rain to see some of these candidates. You know, how many people how loud were the cheers? Was there an energy there, or was it stale? And what's so important about your question is we have missed months of that. The way we've had to gauge enthusiasm is how many participants are on a Zoom rally, if you're able to see that number, you know? And even that is not fair, because who are these people? We don't know. You know, the thing about in person is I can see who these people are. I can ask them where they live. I can ask them how they voted in years past. I have no sense of that, or haven't had a sense of that in the past, you know, since March. I will say this though, you know, I think about during the primary, the Republican and Democratic events that I covered. And some of the ones that are sort of like etched into my memory are, you know, this event called Gallivan's Ferry in South Carolina, where you had like 4 of the Democratic candidates come, and there were swaths of people outside of this convenience store that had gas station pumps in the background, that they'd sort of flipped into this venue for this historical event they have every year called Gallivan's Ferry Stump Speech, right? And there were voters there who, they were like, I'm not gonna say this on camera to you, but I'm voting for Biden this time. And I'm not gonna have his signs in my yard because I don't, you know, my neighbors, they wouldn't like that, but I'm voting for Biden this time. Those stories are real. On the flip side, the other event etched in my mind is being in that arena in North Charleston with hundreds of people clamoring the president's name. And they didn't care about his tax returns not having been released. They didn't care about, I mean, they cared about his tweets, and they said they didn't like it and they wished that he wouldn't say those things, but not enough to not keep them in that room that day. and they were on fire for him. And it was palpable. Like, you know, I tried to explain it to friends and family after. I was like, it was like being at a concert for your favorite, you know, rock star band that you've waited your whole life to see. It was that kind of enthusiasm. That was very real. And I think what we're seeing now, you know, is that reporters like us are having to figure out, how do we gauge where the enthusiasm is after not having been able to do that since March in a substantive way. And we won't be able to, because we're not going to see arenas decked out, I don't think. You know, in a lot of states, they still have limits on how many people can gather in person outside. So I don't know that we're going to get that in these next 30 days. And that is the part that, if I'm being completely transparent, makes me feel the most, you know, the uniqueness of this job as a DJ. It was supposed to be that we were the people on the ground to gauge that kind of thing, to take the temperature every week, every month leading into this election. And it leaves me feeling a bit flat-footed knowing that I haven't been able to do that for months now. And so now what you see is me racing to these states in the past 30 days, trying to talk to as many people as I can to gauge that, you know, and it's hard to do because the sample size is so small.
Okay, well, thank you very much, LaCrai. I mean, you're our rock star tonight for us. We all really enjoyed
This was
hearing all these stories and all the enthusiasm about what's going on. You've really helped fill in the blanks. I know for me in Germany, and some other people in Germany probably. So thanks a lot for talking to us.
No, thanks so much for having me. This was so much fun, and I always love hanging out with my RIAS family. This was great, and you have my email, so definitely feel free to reach out if you have any questions or any follow-ups. This was a lot of fun.
Good. Well, maybe start a Florida alumni chapter and get together there, all you Florida.
I know. That's actually a really great idea. I see your thumbs up, Gina. So I'm recruiting Gina to help me, and Dolores. Yes, all the Florida thumbs up. Let's do it.
Let's do it.